I would like to invite Anand S. to moderate the panel on framework and sustainability and support for open data in India. Anand drives business and technical strategies at Gramener. He is regarded as one of the top 10 data scientists of India. Lately, he was featured as one of the most influential business leaders by the Tech Panda 2500 under 40 list. Anand, over to you to introduce the panelists of this panel and take it over from here.
Thanks, Harushi, and welcome everyone to the panel on framework sustainability and support for open data platforms. I'll dive right in by introducing the panelists, and as I do that, I will also ask each of the panelists, given that we are in a lockdown situation in many locations, what is the weirdest and funniest thing that happened to you in this lockdown? But let's start with the introductions. Monojit. Monojit is a senior advisor, Smart Cities. He works with governments on their smart city strategies and technology. Each of the panelists. Several initiatives of the Pune Smart City, including the launch of the Pune Urban Data Exchange, which is the first of its kind in the Smart Cities mission. Manojit, what was the funniest thing that's happened to you during the lockdown?
Yeah, hi Anand. That's a great question, actually. But then, instead of it being really funny and weird, right? I mean, it has been a little taxing, I would believe, the whole lockdown and the work from home and all of that. And along with it, the whole bunch of other issues which kind of come up from time to time, right? So net, I've been trying to adapt to a new normal and have been doing reasonably well, I would believe, in the new normal.
Got you, Manojit. Let's move on to Gaurav, who is a curious individual who loves reading and running. He leads Fair Forward, which is an AI for all project in India and is aligned to India's AI strategy. He's working on ethical AI, data privacy, and localizing AI training data sets for voice and imagery on a common platform to serve India's next 500 million. Gaurav, what have your lockdown experiences been?
Thanks, Anand. The best part has been that I could see eagles come back to the garden behind my house and actually sit in the garden rather than fly overhead. And that was amazing. And they used to have a conference of not one or eagle, but at least 7 or 8 of them. The second part which I realized was that my park where people used to come and walk, and used to play a lot of cricket has become more greener because of the lockdown, because less people play cricket then. So it's a natural sort of a blessing in disguise for I would say, flora and fauna to flourish during the lockdown.
Let's enjoy it while it lasts. Thanks, Gaurav. Pooja leads the health program communications for the Gates Foundation in India. She develops communication strategies to drive maternal and child health, disease control, and immunization initiatives. And as part of this, she generously leverages research and open data. Pooja, what's been interesting for you during the lockdown?
So, unfortunately, had to go through the COVID experience at home, which was something I could have done without during the lockdown. But I'd say the fun part really was that I did discover an alternate career, which is that of being a hairdresser. So it's been fun learning that and the fact that that's something that is actually doable. You keep discovering.
I can completely relate to that. In case my hair looks odd, I will blame it entirely on home hairdressers. Rajib is a statistician, demographer, and a public health specialist. At the Population Council, he works on sexual and reproductive health issues, focusing on family planning and abortion, child nutrition and health, and improving public data quality as well. Rajib, what was interesting for you?
Yes, thank you, Anand. Nice to connect with everybody here. My experience is again related with COVID. So I had to travel to Uttarakhand for some reason, and I went for a test. Okay, it also connects to data. That's what I'm saying the story to you. So I went to test. I came positive beyond my expectation. I came positive, And a very strange thing was written on my report, say, detected low. And no doctor could actually decipher that. What did you mean by that? Could say positive or negative, nothing else. And then what happened? I was not convinced with that. So I went to another test. The day I got this report, went to another test and I came negative, clearly said negative. So, but the funny thing is not ended there. I did my first test in UP and the second test in Delhi. The first test was positive. So immediately after 3 days or 2 days or 3 days, my Aruggo Setu app showed me as red, positive. Okay. But when I became negative in Delhi data set, I was not removed from that. So I don't know how it works. It's all about data.
And worse yet, if you
And
start
data
publishing,
quality. Yeah.
it's going to be pretty interesting. How does one get off a list after you've gotten
Yes.
onto it? Interesting. Let's talk about that too. And our fifth and final panelist is Sushant, who leads Omidyar Network's investments in the new data economy. He's driving research and advocacy to build an equitable data economy. He's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Data, and he also writes about the data economy on Mint in a column titled Tech for Good. What's happened that's interesting for you, Sushant?
Oh, it's been a comedy of errors during this entire lockdown period. There was this call I was very much looking forward to. It was a one-on-one with the Nobel Prize winning economist, Paul Romer. And I was really looking forward to it. I dressed up in sort of an iron shirt after a very long time and was all set up to go through. And he kind of put me off. I mean, he kind of had me by surprise initially by asking me, so I have a technical question for you. And I was really scared out of my wits. What is a Nobel Prize economist's technical question look like? And exactly while I was pondering over it, I realized that I had forgot to shut the door of the room. And my 3-year-old son walks in with his pant in his hand. And he says, Papa, can you put this on me? So, and I still can't believe it's a true story that really happened to me.
Wow. Wow. So I am curious what the outcome was. Did you or did you not?
I obviously did not. I was worried more about the technical question, which was again funny because he wanted to know how I am in a landscape mode on Zoom and how I can be put in a portrait mode, which kind of was not Nobel worthy, but hey, we figured it out.
Well, the FAQs are all Zoom related these days. No, absolutely delighted to have all of you on. Thank you so much for sharing. And let's, with that, dive right into what we were hoping to focus on, which is the framework, sustainability, and support for open data platforms, which by itself, I guess, raises the obvious question, right? Where does support, specifically in the form of funding, come in from? So I'll start, Rajib, by asking you a question. I've seen the bulk of the data sets on, for example, Kaggle and Google showing non-government data sets, ranging from, let's say, number of downloads from Google Play Store apps, Eurosoccer database, Airbnb, even the Lego parts and the number of UFO sightings. But data in India, at least open data and public data, seems to be largely government related. And maybe therefore the context is different in India. But in your opinion, Rajib, who do you think should fund open data? You're on mute, Rajib.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, it's a good question. Who should fund this? First of all, as you say, that the Indian data are all government data, and the data that are actually used mostly by people, whether it is journalists or I was just listening to the last session on journalist thing, and then all us, right, researchers are all government data, and that's why we work mostly in the government data, and they are free but not always accessible. Okay, but if the question probably is that if to make them freely available, should we charge for that? I can tell you one thing. When I first worked on National Family Health Survey in 1998, We used to we used to get data from sensors for sampling. Okay. And then those data were all free of cost. There was no charge, nothing. We'll just get that data and work on them. Now, if you go and ask for data for sampling in sensors, they actually charge you. Okay, so you can see that government now also understands that yes, at some point we need to charge because that's a huge cost of gathering data. Okay, so I would say data should not be free completely, but it shouldn't be priced accordingly, whether it is for commercial use, for academic use, or for government policy use or something. So I would put it, in a middle. Who should fund? Yes, data users should fund, but in a graded system.
Got it. Users should fund. And it's interesting that you mentioned in a graded way. Pooja, I'd love to take your opinion on this. The users funding, that's certainly one point of view that's come up. There is potentially also graded funding, so subsidies may need to come in. What should the role of private versus government funding be? Or what should the role of the private sector, the government be, in your opinion?
So I would like to sort of build on what Rajiv just said. I think in terms of data collection per se, right? And you rightly said there's a whole lot of government systems. Government has the scale, government has the reach, government has whether you call them archaic systems, but still systems in place in terms of, at least in the Indian context, to gather data. But the usage of data should really define, whether or not the data should be available free of cost. For example, if you look at journalists as a community, you look at media as a community, or you look at researchers as a community. Now, the intention of using data is not necessarily purely commercial, but it's also, for example, knowledge sharing. It's also creating new knowledge, for that matter. If I'm a student and I don't have access to good data, or if I'm having to pay a whole lot to access good data, then that is a huge barrier for my good research outcome. So you don't want to create those barriers in the system. But if I'm a private sector organization, I'd still need that data, or if I don't have the capability of collecting it on my own, or something like census data for that matter, I should be in a position to sort of do some sort of a payment to be able to fund that entire data collection process, as well as also sustain that process in the long term. And I also believe that some bit of that funding also brings a certain degree of quality check or accountability in the way the data itself is captured. So, you do want to sort of look at a bit of a dual mechanism on this one, I believe.
Fair point. So what I'm taking away then is that the private use of data, or at least the private sector's use of data, could potentially cross-subsidize where it would be or should be made free. And that brings me to another question, which Gaurav, I'd like to pose to you along the same topic. So how does one figure out what constitutes a common good? Meaning, how do we decide that this data should be made open and free of charge or at a lower cost versus not this?
Yeah, I think I will take 2 points on this argument. Our approach has been to look at the open voice data set in India, and I would actually concur with both Pooja, and with Rajib. So for us, what has happened is we found that most of these open data voice data sets were in Indian Institute of Technology or Triple IT Hyderabad, or as you said, academic or research institutions. But the set was small. The set was small because the content, in terms of advancing technology, you don't need big data to actually work on your NLP engines or any of these, high tech sort of applications to train your AI sort of framework. But for actually doing something which actually makes for common good and gets back to people, the set of amount of data for open voice minimum is 1,000 hours needed for any startup or any potential to make money out of it. Let's put it that way. And hence, what our idea is to have consolidated data. And there are some agencies, then there are two aspects to it. Commercial aspect is Google does have 10,000 hours of data, but it will not share. But then there is a component of, say, Microsoft Research, which are still collecting data, and I'm still talking about voice. and they can actually do it because this is not for profit. So there is this fine line dividing. If you are, and that will be disruption in India, because data in terms of very particular sets that we are looking at, because of non-availability, there is a lot of focus by the government, by the way. I'm still trying to bring the government component, but there is not much happening even by the ministry in terms of support. There is, but then the quantity is not available, and if it is available, it is fragmented. So that's it. I would stop there, but I would say that where do you actually see, for commercial use, for impact, you need a larger access to data and collection as it needs to be happening. Yeah.
Got it. And from a funding perspective, then, having heard Rajib, Pooja, and Gaurav, all three of you, what I take away is that the synthesis seems to be that it needs to be self-funded, meaning the initiatives have to be sustainable by themselves, for which usage-based funding is perhaps the best approach, but not all usage is equal, that some are for public good and therefore needs to be subsidized, which can happen through a private sector, and that it's not realistic to expect any kind of government or ministry support on this, that it would really have to come from a usage drive, which is on the demand side, as well as from the private sector side, which is more on the supply side. Which leads me to another question. Actually, this builds, Rajiv, on your experience on being COVID positive and then COVID negative, right? Which is when we start looking at data, open data, public data coming out, there are, on the one hand, privacy implications and there are quality implications. Quality in the sense this is right, privacy in the sense that should this be shared. And by pushing for more open data, we are taking on all of these risks. At the same time, by keeping data private or closed, we are limiting access to information and what is possible. And while this is, as always, a balance, I'd be curious through a poll to the audience to see where the audience stands, and they can take this poll as we continue our discussion. I'd request the moderator to turn on the poll for this session. The question being, what should we focus our current attention more on? Is it on improving the data quality and privacy? Or is it increasing access to data? Both are relevant, no question. On the margin, which one of these do you, as the audience, think we should be focusing more on? Please do fill in your responses on the poll. As panelists, we wouldn't be able to see the poll, but I do hope that it's in front of you. From a panel perspective, I'd like us to go on. Let me talk about the, let's start with the privacy issue. A few years ago, I was browsing through the HPCL website looking for my customer ID, and I found that it had my address and a fair bit of details about me listed there without me having to log in, which is good. So I just changed the ID, adding one, and it gave me another address for another person with their phone number and their email ID and exactly what kind of gas connection they had subscribed. And I just went on to the next number and the next number and the next number, which was actually no different from what I'd seen a student do when looking at the CBSE marks in 2014. Put in their roll number, yep, you get the marks. Put in a different roll number, you get the marks. And you have pretty much every single person's data, which actually proved very useful because it led to a series of articles in the media on how there were a surprisingly large number of students who got exactly 95%. Why would that be? And that led to a story on the investigation of why there was a push to give students 95% or less, because one of the metrics that is being reported by the media is how many students got more than 95%. So if you keep it at 95, then that's less pressure from, I guess, both the student and the parent side, as well as from the media side. Now, a story like that couldn't have come out if that data hadn't been open. But at the same time, it certainly, I'm sure nobody intended to make every single student's name, marks, and more details than that public. There's also the question of how does one make corrections to that, like it happened in your case, Rajib, if somebody is having their the details tagged wrong. Should we, and Sushant, I'd love to pose this question to you first. Should we focus more on tightening controls given where we are at the moment? Or should we focus more on increasing access to data?
Oh, sure. So thanks for that story. It's quite revealing and eye-opening for many who haven't thought about this before. So first of all, I don't think these should be seen as an either-or situation where increasing access means that safeguards and controls cannot be put in place. They can both coexist. And in fact, so one of the causes of or the reasons for open data over the last 2 decades, for example, not having achieved its potential is this limitation or this perceived dichotomy between access versus controls. And I'll give you an example why I'm saying so. And it reflects on a bit about the chicken versus egg solution on whether you create a good ecosystem for data first by investing upfront and then potentially making it sustainable. Or can you just expect that data to be available through some magic and therefore people will come and pay for it and use it, etc., etc. So the example which I always go back to as a success of open data is the Transport for London example, TfL. And there are a couple of good reasons why I say so. First of all, you wouldn't even know that when you are in London and trying to take a tube or a bus or a ferry, you wouldn't even know that these are potentially at some levels different transport modes because they are in the end being handled by the same organization, which is Transport for London. They have a setup which also has, other than the usual governance, they have a technical governance setup, which is almost as an institution with the technical capabilities and the funding, which comes from the overall budget of TfL, which is tasked to make sure that the back-end infrastructure for that data availability is ensured. And the result of that is entrepreneurs are able to access that data. And me, if I'm standing at any bus stop in London, I'm able to access which bus will take me to the nearest tube station, etc., etc. And this is seamless. And that has happened because there was a startup capital. In the sense, there was a catalyst capital that came in through a government subsidy, which ensured that there was a critical mass created for entrepreneurs to come in, make it useful enough so that when an X% of budget is allocated for a data-related expenditure, it doesn't pinch as much because Deloitte conducted an assessment and realized that Transport for London added $300 million of value on an annual basis to the city of London. So having said that, I just feel like these pieces of the puzzle are linked together. There's the question of infrastructure, institution, and there needs to be that activation, that inherent investment in making sure some of these exist. Now, going back to your question, there is no dichotomy in my mind between safeguards and accessibility. The reason why I say this, there's an increasing movement towards stewarded data. Having data lying openly is prone to misuse. Having data made available and accessible for individuals, about individuals' details, personal details, without the technical and the capability to understand what elements should not be there is harmful. So increasing access from the side of government to say, I don't know, I'll take a simple example. When you used to go to the railway station every time and check our names on that list, it also had our PAN numbers on it or any sort of ID that you put on it. That's open data, probably useful at some point, but someone sitting there and printing did not realize that this is personal information. Similar to your point about personal data being easily accessible. So stewarded data meaning thinking about what type of data do I need to make accessible? What, therefore, should be the checks and balances in place? What technical and governance mechanisms we need to put in place those checks and balances? Therefore, do we have the right capability, both technical as well as the regulatory and the legal capability to make sure those checks and balances are in place? And lastly, make sure that the access is not restricted, but access is managed in a way that you're very simple. The website doesn't crash because the web crawlers have um, just kind of crashed on it, or just making sure that in cases where data is to be made available only to credible agencies, that access can be managed. So while I'm all for open data, I also believe in certain cases where privacy safeguards are essential, there we need the right capabilities, technical as well as governance related, to make sure it is stewarded in the right manner.
Stewardship being the critical point. Monojit, I'd love to ask you to expand on this theme, meaning what should we focus on more at the moment? Building that stewardship because that is a bigger gap, and ensuring that the checks and balances are right, or we have that reasonably sorted out and we should really focus more on getting the data out and managing the access better.
Thanks, Anand. Now, I would like to answer this in two parts, basically, right? So, on one hand, right, I completely agree with what Sushant was talking about, and there are a lot of debates going on. But then I am equally clear that in terms of access and safeguard, right, I mean they are not either and or kind of a thing. And this particular aspect is kind of getting handled through one of the initiatives of the ministry, which is the India Urban Data Exchange. And I can talk about the Pune Urban Data Exchange, where certain authentication measures are being put in place and all of that, right? Without getting into the details of what the PUDX is all about. Uh, Now that's one part of it, Anand. But my bigger point is, I mean, you have multiple data sets, say, residing on an urban data exchange, and you make all these data sets available to a lot of people outside who would be interested. I was very patiently hearing about various aspects of monetization of the data, and that's also a valid point, right? Now, the situation where we stand today, I mean, we cannot be doing things in a sequence, meaning one thing is done and then we take up the next one, and several things have to happen in parallel, right? And monetization is one initiative which has to happen. The safeguards is another one which has to happen. But where I do not see too many things happening, or I may be wrong for want of information, is what is it that you do with this data, right? So imagine a situation where you have a data exchange or an open data portal, right? And you have multiple data sets, and I'm not even getting into the quality of the data which is being put up on the open data portal or is being routed through the exchange. So that's a different debate altogether. Assuming for a moment that the quality of data is good, the data is all usable, what is it that you do with it? Now, this is where, I personally have encountered a lot of challenges, and I would be happy to hear point of views on how these could be solved, right? So, say, for example, we have a situation in a city, and as you are aware, that the cities are grappling with multiple challenges every passing day, and the challenges are just increasing by the day. And therefore, that brings in the need for urban innovation, and open data feeds into the urban innovation beautifully. But then you expose the data sets, you have a lot of people coming in and participating. You have the startups, you have the academia, what we call as the quadruple helix, as we say, right? You have multiple stakeholders participating and trying to create out of box solutions to complex problems, right? What is it that you do after that? Are there business models which ensure that it's a win-win for all the participants who are participating in this innovation journey on the basis of the open data which is being made available to them? How do you procure innovation, Anand, is something I honestly do not have clear visibility on, right? Given the procurement processes within the government, and as I'm talking from a city level mainly, right? How do you procure innovation with all the open data which you're going to be exposing, right? The next point then is, I mean, the procurement is one. I mean, how do you really scale these initiatives up? So there is, say, an experiment which has been done with a certain data set, and then you find some remarkable insights out of that experiment. How do you convert that into a project? How do you scale that up? The third point is, I mean, innovation, assuming you were to put together all of this in a certain way, How do you make innovation at a city level institutionalized and systemic, right? So that it is not individual dependent, and the system as a whole embraces innovation on the basis of the open data which is being made available to solve real life problems of people in the city, to solve problems of the administration, right? So whereas I completely agree with the point of view on open data and all the efforts, all the debate going on around in terms of safeguards, in terms of accessibility, in terms of monetization, I would love it if there is some discussion around how do you make innovation more systemic? How at a city level, how does the government go about procuring innovation from a bunch of startups, or in some cases, it's a mix of startups and academia? And what is the kind of business model which could drive and allow these innovations at a city level with open data as the base thrive? I will end my point here, Anand.
Oh, a fascinating question, an aspect of which I'd love to take up right after this. So, from what I hear on the debate on this topic in terms of tightening versus loosening policies on open data, what I take away is that we see this as a false dichotomy, that quality and privacy are essential and we need to add those checks, but that ought not to and need not slow down the opening up of data, which I think is a critical element. It's also interesting to note that from the survey, the poll that we conducted, we have 2/3 of the participants saying we have to focus on the quality and privacy, and a third of them saying that we need to focus more on opening access to data. There are over 300 people in the auditorium right now. So the message that we probably want to share is you're both right, of course, and each of you perceives one aspect of the problem, but the reality is that we probably have to move on both sides, and where we have the ability to put in those checks and balances, we should do right away. But where that's in place, or where there is a framework in place, let's just move on and keep opening up the data. Which brings me to an aspect of what Monojit, you were talking about, and I'd like to pose my next question to just give me a second to Sushant. What should we focus on opening up? What kind of data should we focus on? And let me share a brief anecdote. So at the moment, DataMeet is one of the largest open data user groups. And I was browsing through the last 5 requests for data that have come in. The most recent was for the Chennai transit data, a request for a hackathon for suburban railways, MTC, and the Chennai Metro, which is very similar to the TFL request that you mentioned, Sushant. The second was data, and this was for a hackathon. Second request was for domestic violence data for a news article. COVID-19 deaths. What is the population by PIN code? Where can I get the census village boundaries? Where can I get IMD rainfall data? On the one hand, there is a stream of requests coming in, and at least there's one place where we can find it. But clearly, there needs to be a thought-through approach on who the users are, who are the biggest consumers of open data, what their needs are, and use that as an input to focus on what to open up. What mechanisms exist and what could be put in place for this, Sushant?
Sure. So that's a very good question, one that has made me think about it afresh. So Anand, I think, first of all, what's very important, which Monojit also mentioned, he mentioned IUDX, the Indian Urban Data Exchange. So plays the same role, I would say, that India Data Portal intends to, which is to provide that platform which has the framework, the sustainable funding, the ability to project manage and put in place those checks and balances, and therefore be the enabler of this open data movement going forward. And instead of sort of the lack of access for reasons of, whatever be the reasons, but instead of lack of access, it creates that, smoothens the process of access. So these frameworks, platforms are extremely critical and important. To your question, I think starting from public purpose, and also putting in a filter of uh, non-personal data by nature. And when I say that, what I mean is it's it it might be relatively straightforward to filter. I'm saying this with a with some cautiousness. It may be straightforward to filter out non-personal data by nature, where the required safeguards and the potential for harms to individuals or communities might be perceivably lower. And for that, the examples that come to mind immediately, both from the lens of less harms or less sensitive to harms, as well as utility once you make that open, is the top example that you mentioned was for transport. So any sort of transport related data, which is related to GPS data of buses or of metro or any other last mile related data of how people travel. Uh, Ola Mobility Institute at one point was utilizing data from its taxis about where and trying to derive insights about where there are potholes in the city. So there is an extent of insights that can be drawn from this transport data, which can be helpful both in transport itself, but at the next level in urban planning. And it is non-personal data by nature, and therefore relatively less requirement in terms of technical and legal safeguards or liabilities in terms of that. On that, I also want to add that Delhi, Triple IT Delhi has pro bono worked with the Delhi government to cover 50% of Delhi transport buses, both for tracking their GPSs and create that open data platform in the back end where a transport for London type application is possible for Delhi people. They went one step further and also brought in something like Charter, which is an app to book your tickets. Now, from a non-sensitive data about bus location, they are moving to data about individuals and individuals' credit card. And therefore, what you need is a seamless transition between openly accessible data to stewarded data. And therefore, it kind of fit, both of these fit in. So you mentioned domestic violence, transport, etc. I think there are a couple more. So we didn't have data about migrant labor. Why was that? There are entities and individuals like Foundation for Ecological Security, which have created Indian Data Observatory, which is tracking some of these data in real time, and this could be very, very useful. The second is about business in the country, economic activity in the country. There are private sector efforts in this regard, but this is a data that sits with the government, and what it needs is that platform, an IDP or an IUDX kind of platform, to enable it with the right safeguards as the government may want it, plus more intent on the elements that they already have, national sample survey and things like that. There are other sort of long list of non-personal data which I believe can be prioritized for greater access, and eventually move towards anonymized data sets or anonymized aggregated insights which can be made available.
Got it. So what I take away here is that let's go with what's easy, in that there's a large enough portfolio of non-personal data sets that could be opened up. So from a priority perspective, what's easy to expose is certainly one factor. Pooja, I'd love to pose the same question to you, which is how does one go about prioritizing, and how do user needs play a part in this?
So I'm going to actually sort of bring in a more like a development sector perspective here, Anand, right? Because when you're looking at the sector as a whole, one of the challenges to creating good solutions is the lack of good data, right? Because if you don't have data on, for example, different parameters of public health, even if one was to look at the COVID situation, right? I mean, what's the number of cases that's happening? what's the death rate, what's the mortality, what's the recovery rate. I mean, we're tracking that on a hourly basis now, right? And that's what is giving us either the confidence that we're getting to a better place, or it's making us really worry about what action we need to take in a particular, say, containment zone, or at a state level, in terms of the messaging, in terms of the availability of health workers, in terms of the preparedness of hospitals, etc., right? So all of your decision making in real time is actually being driven by the access to data and the access to the right data. And that, to my mind, is the perfect example of why you need all of this data, and you need it um, from the right sort of perspectives. You want to know district level, block level. You want to understand the macro view. You want to understand how the different, even gender data for that matter, right? I mean, we've talked about the fact that you don't have gender aggregated data, and that really, gender disaggregated data, which really makes it difficult to say whether it's the woman of the house who's getting the support, or it's the man, etc. And I think that's really where the decision about what data sets are you making available, because these are the key challenges that a country faces or a state faces. You need to, as holders of that data, if I'm a state government, for example, I need to make those data sets available to the public at large. One, because that's how solutions will start to emerge. That will give me an extent of what the problem is and how big it is, and therefore what kind of investments need to go into solve it. It'll also drive a certain degree of accountability from the system itself, right? Because for me to say, well, I invested so much, means nothing unless and until I'm able to measure and track what's the kind of benefit it's had, what is the pre and post, so to say. So in many ways, data sets that are enablers for public goods, with all of the elements that Sushant spoke about with regards to managing and ensuring that privacy is not compromised, but you need those kind of data sets available at large for the right kind of storytelling, for the right kind of narratives to be built, for the right kind of solution sets to be sort of startups to be nudged into creating those solution sets as well. And I think the private sector does a brilliant job of that, right? I mean, if I'm a Pepsi, I collect the data, I get that access to data, and that's how I decide. My business decisions are all driven by good data. Why not mirror those practices in the public health and the social space, because that's what's going to drive progress and the ability to actually make those solutions accessible to people at large. And I just want to sort of also mention an element here about, when you look at the SDGs, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals that we're looking at, the only way to track is through robust data sets. We spoke about data quality, we spoke about data access. I think you need good quality data, but you also want to make it accessible as much as is possible for all of these pieces. So it's not a who comes first. It's like all of these really working together to make some of these solution sets happen.
Got it. And that's an interesting complementary thought, because what Sushant spoke about was how does one reduce the effort of making it available, while you're talking about how does one increase the benefit of what comes out, which we can do by focusing on what really enables the country's needs or challenges, or the state's needs or challenges as determined by the respective development goals, which gives a framework then effectively saying focus on those that have high impact and focus on those that have open or non-personal data, which we start with. And that's the quadrant that we need to focus on, which tells us what to go in for. My next question I'd like to pose to Rajib and Gaurav. This is related to what you see as the biggest challenges to open data today and how we can help overcome them. From my personal experience, just the way in which we access has been a problem for a very long time, and it's only in the last couple of years that has opened up. So if you asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, look, if I need to get the census shape files, it takes, it has actually taken me 8 years to get to them. And I did not get to those shape files from the Survey of India. But on the other hand, it's actually easier to walk over to the office with a pen drive, and as long as you know the right person and make the request the right way, just get it from the pen drive then and there, which is odd. Or, for example, PIN code shape files. We were working with the Karnataka Post Office, who had created manually the shape files for pretty much every PIN code in Karnataka and uploaded it on Bhuvan. The trouble is they have the right to upload but not download, which they learned much later, which again is a pretty strange kind of situation to be in. And these kinds of challenges just blew my mind. But I'm obviously seeing only a small part of it, and you have very different perspectives. What do you see today as the biggest challenges to open data, and what can we do about them? Rajib? Okay, we may have lost Rajib temporarily. Gaurav would love to pose the same question to you, please.
Yeah, for us, I think when we try to get to different sources of data, we realize that the quality differs a lot. So the quality differentiation was first thing, and the second part was that I would say 3 years back the technology integration into data synthesis was not as advanced as it is now. So what you can do now with even little bit of error or what we call noise in the data, you can still work with it, and the percentage of that errors have improved. On the satellite imagery, what we realized that Indian space remote sensing data was huge, and which is but then what we posed as the problem was the bureaucracy in getting the data was much more of a complex problem rather than really getting the data from an Indian standpoint. But we also realized that we are working in 4 countries in Africa. Uh, I think sometimes when you talk to less number of people to get your things done, it gets easier to collect data and to mobilize the community to actually donate data. And once you actually have set the parameters for collection right, I think getting data is becomes easier. I mean, we are still limiting it to our challenges, but India is an elephant to get the data and specifically particular type of data on what you want to work with. So yeah.
That's an interesting perspective, and I'd like Monojit for your perspective on this as well. But what I take away from what you said, Gaurav, is that whatever challenges exist are far fewer now than they were before, and perhaps the challenge has shifted away from what we get to what to ask for. The parameters or the specs that we put in are really the bigger challenge than getting the data, which is an interesting perspective.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, if I can take 30 seconds, I will tell you an example where we were working with Asian Development Bank, and they have now integrated their urban development infrastructure based on GIS systems. So every pipeline, every sewage line, every electricity line, every road, every toilet, everything that they make is now linked to one house number. So it actually helps you to collect data in an instant because it is done by ADB, and I'm talking about specifically in the state of Rajasthan. So just a very simple example. This never used to happen. So initially, when you used to take data for whether you're having water every 2 days or every 5 days, 2 hours a day, it used to be a mammoth effort. Now it is not.
Fascinating. Manojit, what are your thoughts on the challenges that we face today in open data?
Anand, it actually depends on the way you look at it, right? So when we talk of open data, and again, I would be talking more from a city perspective, right? Uh, uh, it's the data from different, organizations, the parastatal organizations and the urban local bodies which are within the city, right? So one of the biggest impediments, which I believe is, a kind of a challenge, is the amount of data which is even residing within these departments and parastatal organizations, right? So that's one. Second is, even if the data is available, right? I mean, it's largely in manual form. And then it is also the way the data is captured, right? So I'll give you an example here, right? So, there was this particular instance where there's a doctor who is treating the TB patients, and when a certain drug is being administered, or there's a follow-up checkup after that, there's a checklist which is required to be filled up, right? And when the checklist is getting filled up, one of the columns in the checklist is, the kind of meal which has been recommended for that particular patient, and it gives you an option: veg, non-veg, or something else. Now, when you go through some of these forms, I mean, so here what I'm trying to say is the data is there, the data is in manual form, but then when you go through these forms, what you see is under the column, what is the kind of meal which has been recommended? There is a tick and it says as discussed. Now you say have thousands of these forms which are made available to you, and you're going to go about digitizing the data, and these are the forms which are given to you. I mean, how will you interpret these forms as? So a patient A, you don't know the meal which this person has been recommended, and it is just written as discussed. And this is say a year back's data. You have no way to find out. So these are some of the ground level practical issues which are there, right? Uh, Whether the situation is as difficult as it was several years back, probably the answer is no. There's a lot of change which is coming in. There's a lot of emphasis on digitizing the data. There's a lot of emphasis which is on filling up the forms, even if manually the right way. And slowly but surely, all of this will go up into the open data portals which are available. But till the basics are really worked upon, I mean, it's going to be really difficult to have a plethora of data sets which are available on the portal. That's my kind of take on what the challenges are, right?
Fascinating. What I take away from that is that it's not as much opening up as much as how can we collect data better at the
Yes.
source.
And if
That's
I can have another 15, 20 seconds on this. The second thing, from a city standpoint, when we talk about urban innovation, and that is something which is a must, I mean, it's like, you have to do it kind of, otherwise you're not going to be solving the problem. What we have been able to do is basically two things, right? I mean, so uh, uh, there are certain data sets, where you have good quality data, right? It's not that all the data sets are bad or all are very good. There are certain data sets which are really good, which are good quality usable data. You expose those and allow the people to, try all kinds of analytics on that and see what all interesting problems can be solved. Another way which we have tried out is we try to frame the problem statements, Anand. So we know at a city level which all are the tricky, the most complex kind of problems. We define a problem statement, and for those problem statements, whatever data sets are required, they may or may not be available in the open data portal, largely because, for all they may be in some files here and there, right, which has to be dug out. But then we capture all those data sets and provide it when we do the hackathons or all these urban challenges. Basically, the point is that a data set not being available in open data portals, uh, uh, it's desirable, but then it's not a challenge in the way that if you really want to drive innovation at a city level, you still try to find your way out and try to take photocopies or scan or do whatever and send the data sets by email. So that's another way we have kind of tried to go about in beating the challenges around open data, but at the same time wanting to drive innovation, at a city level.
and that's a fascinating trade-off that we make there. But I'm going to summarize now what we've heard from all of us so far. We have just a couple of minutes left. We talked about 4 topics: funding, who and how should open data be funded, and our consensus was it really should be self-funded by the users who will be benefiting from that data, with the private usage subsidizing the public usage. We talked about the trade-off between quality and privacy versus increasing access. It's something we believe is a false dichotomy, that quality and privacy are essential and we need to add these checks, but that should not and need not slow down the opening up of data. We discussed how to prioritize what data should open up. And our takeaway is that we should focus on the countries or the states' development priorities and align with that, while at the same time picking those data sets that don't have personalized data to make it easier for us to make it open. And finally, we talked about challenges, and it's interesting that opening data itself has become positive to the point where the challenges are not as much there as they are on knowing what to ask for, or making sure that the underlying data source which is collected is on par enough to be of good quality for when the data opens up. This, for me certainly, and I'm sure for the audience, was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, firstly, to Rajib, who had to leave early. I apologize. I had mentioned to him that we would release him by 4:40, but forgot to mention that in this audience. Thank you, Rajib. Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you, Monojit. Thank you, Pooja. Thank you, Sushant. It was fascinating talking to all of you. Arushi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anand. And thank you to all the panelists. Thanks for such an interesting and informative panel discussion. Talking of developing a framework, the panel discussed high impact and the focus on open data. The issues of sustainability and support for open data were talked about at length during this panel. We ourselves are hosting this open data conclave under the edges of India Data Portal at ISB, an open access data portal built for convenient search and visualizations. We are truly thankful to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for supporting the India Data Portal project. Thanks to all our panelists today, Pooja, Sehgal, Sushant, Kumar, Monojit, Gaurav, Rajib, and Anand. Thank you once again.